So imagine this. For centuries, Europe tore itself apart over religion. Then, suddenly, it stopped. But that created a whole new, terrifying problem. If you're not fighting for God anymore, what stops one power-hungry king from just taking over everything? Well, it turns out the answer was a new set of rules for a very, very old game, the game of survival. And look, this wasn't just some academic debate. This was the question that kept every king, every diplomat, every general awake at night after 1648. I mean, the 30 Years' War had absolutely shattered the continent. The fear was real, that some new, superpowered empire would rise from the rubble and just steamroll everybody. They needed a solution, and they needed one fast. All right, so let's get into it. To really understand the solution they came up with, you first have to get a handle on just how much the problem had changed. The whole reason for fighting in Europe was shifting. It wasn't about God anymore. It was about cold, hard power, what we call realpolitik. So the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, it basically took religion off the table as the main reason to go to war. But in doing that, it kind of opened Pandora's box. What rushed out was just raw, unfiltered self-interest, dynastic ambition. All of a sudden, the kingdom next door wasn't a bunch of heretics you had to convert. No, they were just a rival standing between you and more land, more resources, more security.
Okay, so how do you manage a continent full of ambitious, paranoid states? Well, they came up with a kind of unwritten rulebook, a new political operating system for Europe.
And the central principle of this whole system was this idea, the balance of power. It's actually pretty simple when you think about it. Picture a giant seesaw. If one country starts getting way too powerful, too heavy on one side, all the other countries would team up and jump on the other side to bring it back into balance. The goal here wasn't really permanent peace, not at all. It was about creating a stable, predictable kind of competition.
And you can really see the shift laid out here. We go from the old way, fighting for God, trying to make everyone believe the same thing, to the new way. Now it's all about fighting for your state, for territory, for security. The goal isn't converting souls anymore. It's just making sure nobody else gets strong enough to push you around. It's a massive pivot from fighting for ideas to fighting for survival. So this new system had a couple of major tools in its toolbox. Let's start with the first one, the diplomatic move. And don't let the word diplomatic fool you. This could be just as brutal as any war. And there is no better or more tragic example of this than what happened to Poland. I mean, if you just looked at a map in the 18th century, Poland was huge, an absolute giant. But that size was totally misleading. It was kind of like a paper tiger. Internally, it was a mess, weak, disorganized, and surrounded by these lean, mean, highly centralized kingdoms. Poland was basically a giant steak sitting in the middle of a den of hungry wolves. And this is where you see the ice-cold logic of this system in action. Russia, Prussia, and Austria, they all looked at each other and basically said, hey, why fight amongst ourselves when we can just maintain our balance by carving up this giant weak country in the middle? So, in 1772, they took the first slice. Poland freaked out and tried to get its act together to reform. Well, its neighbors couldn't have that, so in 1793, they took an even bigger piece. And by 1795, it was over. Poland was just gone, wiped clean off the map of Europe. So why was Poland such an easy target? It really boils down to the basic building blocks of a modern state. You look at its neighbors. They had powerful kings, huge professional armies, and, crucially, efficient tax systems to pay for all of it. Now look at Poland. A weak king, powerful nobles who refused to pay their taxes, and a tiny, underfunded army. It just wasn't built to survive in this new, hyper-competitive world. It failed to modernize, and it paid the ultimate price. But sometimes, diplomacy wasn't enough. When a country got so ambitious that treaties couldn't hold it back, the system turned to its other, much blunter instrument, all-out war. And for a long time, the big bad of Europe, the one country that everyone was terrified would wreck the whole balance, was France. Especially under the famous Sun King, Louis XIV. France had the money, it had the people, and boy, did it have ambition. And here's just one number that tells you everything you need to know about why they were so scared. 400,000. That's how big Louis XIV's professional permanent army was. It was a military machine on a scale Europe had literally never seen before. Right, so this all blew up with something called the War of the Spanish Succession. Here's what happened. The King of Spain died without a kid, and in his will, he left the throne to Louis XIV's grandson. The rest of Europe just panicked. A united France and Spain, a single family controlling both of those massive empires in Europe and the Americas, it was their worst nightmare. A megastate that would be totally unstoppable. It was the ultimate threat, and it had to be stopped at all costs. So after more than a decade of incredibly bloody continent-wide war, they finally hammered out a peace treaty. And this treaty is just a perfect example of balance of power thinking. They said, okay, fine, Louis' grandson can be the king of Spain. But, and this was the non-negotiable part, the crowns of France and Spain could never be united. The megastate was off the table. And just like that, the balance was restored. Okay, so there's a really important byproduct of all this. This constant maneuvering, this endless cycle of diplomacy and war, it had a huge unintended consequence. Just to survive, just to even have a seat at the table, countries had to totally transform themselves from the inside out. And this right here, this is the engine that literally forged the modern state. It's like a chain reaction, just follow the logic. 1, constant war means you need a professional army that's always ready. 2, those armies are insanely expensive. 3, to pay for them, you need a ton of cash. 4, to get that cash, you need an efficient government bureaucracy that's great at collecting taxes. And 5, to manage that whole system, you need a strong, centralized government, usually under a powerful king. See how one thing leads directly to the next? So, here's the bottom line. Building a powerful, centralized state wasn't just a good idea anymore. It was the price you had to pay just to play the game. You either got with the program, modernized, and turned your kingdom into a lean, mean, war-fighting machine, or you ended up like Poland, knocked right off the board. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? What's the legacy of this whole system? Well, it dominated European politics for more than 150 years, and what it left behind is, well, it's pretty complicated. It's a paradox, really. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. Think about it. They created a system designed to create stability, to prevent one giant, catastrophic war. But what it actually did was make smaller wars normal. It made conquest a legitimate tool of diplomacy, and it kicked off an arms race that became a permanent part of life. That's the huge irony here. And that leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as real for us today as it was back then. Does a world full of balanced powers actually create real stability? Or does it just trap everyone in a permanent cycle of competition and conflict? Does it stop the big war only by making the small ones endless? It makes you wonder if the game, in all its deadly seriousness, ever really stops?